August 13, 2018. In the quiet town of Frederick, Colorado, a mother and her 2 young daughters suddenly vanished. Shanann Watts, who was 15 weeks pregnant, disappeared along with 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. At first, there were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no clear answers. The public quickly rallied, searching for clues and sharing Shanann's smiling photos online. And standing at the center of it all was her husband, Chris Watts. On television, he pleaded for their safe return, his voice steady as he begged anyone with information to come forward. But within just days, everything changed. That same man, the husband and father who seemed so desperate to bring them home, would confess to murdering them. On Shanann's social media, her life looked picture-perfect. Happy family snapshots, loving captions, and videos of her daughters singing and playing painted a case of joy and stability. But behind those images, darkness was growing, and soon, the entire world would see the truth. Why would a husband and father destroy the family he claimed to love? In this case, we'll walk through the timeline, the evidence, the chilling confession, and the courtroom moments that gripped the nation, and together, we'll try to answer that haunting question. To the outside world, the Watts family seemed like the picture of stability. Shanann Watts, born in North Carolina in 1984, was known for her energy, drive, and positivity. She had faced health struggles, including lupus, but she never let it define her. Friends described her as strong-willed, caring, and ambitious. In 2012, Shanann met Chris Watts through mutual friends on Facebook. At first, she was hesitant. She worried her illness might scare him away. But Chris appeared gentle and patient, the kind of man who seemed steady and supportive. Within a few years, the two married and settled in Frederick, Colorado, where Chris worked at Anadarko Petroleum and Shanann built her career with the health and lifestyle company, Thrive. Online, Shanann shared updates about her life, smiling selfies, motivational posts, and videos featuring her 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. To her followers, the Watts family looked like a model of love and success, a hard-working father, a devoted mother, and 2 happy children. By 2018, Shanann was also expecting their 3rd child, a boy she planned to name Nico. Friends noticed how much Shanann adored her family. She spoke often about how Chris had saved her, giving her a second chance at life after years of personal challenges. In public, Chris appeared quieter and reserved but was always present at her side in photos and videos. The Watts family's home in a quiet suburban neighborhood added to the image of the American dream. A new house, 2 kids, growing careers, and another child on the way. From the outside, it all looked perfect. But as we would later learn, behind those smiles, the marriage was under strain. Shanann's constant efforts to keep the family together masked problems that were quietly growing, problems that would soon become impossible to hide. By the summer of 2018, the image of a perfect family was beginning to fracture. Those closest to Shanann noticed it first. She confided to friends that Chris seemed different, more distant, less affectionate, almost like a stranger in his own home. In text messages later entered into evidence, Shanann described how he stopped touching her, how his phone suddenly seemed glued to his hand, and how his responses to her loving messages grew cold. "I don't know who you are anymore," she told him in one exchange. At the same time, Chris was living a double life. In June 2018, he began a romantic relationship with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. At first, their connection appeared casual, conversations at work, a lunch here, a walk there. But within weeks, it became an affair. According to Kessinger's later interviews with investigators, Chris presented himself as a man trapped in an unhappy marriage, claiming it was nearing its end. She believed him. The secrecy gave Chris a new sense of excitement. While Shanann was posting cheerful family photos and preparing for the birth of their son, Chris was going on dates, spending hours on the phone with Nicole, and even searching online for vacation spots they could visit together. Shanann, meanwhile, tried desperately to hold the marriage together. During a trip to North Carolina that summer to visit family, she texted Chris about her fears. She begged him to talk to her, to reassure her that they still had a future. "I just don't feel like you're in this with me anymore," she wrote. Her closest friends later told investigators that Shanann felt something was slipping away, but she couldn't quite name what it was. The contrast between their lives could not have been sharper. Shanann was posting videos of the girls singing, "My daddy is my hero." Chris, in those same days, was searching online for wedding songs and engagement ideas, but not for Shanann. By August, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Shanann traveled on a business trip to Arizona. From there, she sent friends messages that were more urgent than ever. She suspected Chris was seeing someone else. She worried the marriage she fought so hard to build was unraveling. On the night of August 12th, Shanann flew back to Colorado. A friend dropped her at her home just after 2 a.m. It would be the last time she was seen alive. On the morning of August 13th, the first signs of trouble appeared. Shanann was scheduled for an OB/GYN appointment that day, but she never arrived. She also missed a crucial business meeting. For someone known to keep a packed schedule and respond instantly to calls and texts, her silence was alarming. Her close friend, Nicole Atkinson, the same friend who had dropped her off just hours earlier, grew increasingly uneasy. By late morning, Shanann still hadn't responded. Her calls went unanswered, her texts unread. By noon, Nicole decided to drive back to the Watts home herself. When she arrived, she immediately noticed unsettling details. Shanann's car was still in the garage. Through a window, she saw the family dog, Dieter, pacing alone. But there was no sign of Shanann or the girls. The house was locked tight. Nicole called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. At around 1:40 p.m., Officer Scott Kuhn arrived. His body-worn camera would later capture the first documented images inside the Watts home. Chris appeared a short time later. His demeanor surprised many who later saw the footage. He was calm, polite, and cooperative, showing none of the panic one might expect from a husband and father whose pregnant wife and 2 young daughters had seemingly vanished. Inside the house, the officers quickly spotted red flags. Shanann's purse was still there, along with her phone, wallet, and keys. Her shoes and suitcase were upstairs, unpacked at the foot of the bed. It was as if she had simply vanished from her own home without taking the essentials she carried everywhere. On the body cam, Nicole can be heard pointing out how strange it all was. "Her car's here, her phone's here, her shoes are here. Where would she go?" she pressed, visibly worried. Chris offered explanations that didn't seem to fit. He suggested she had taken the kids to a friend's house but couldn't provide details. To investigators, it was an early sign that his answers weren't lining up with the facts. Later that day, Chris stepped in front of local television cameras. Standing on his porch, he pleaded for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste to come home. His words were measured, his arms folded tightly as he looked into the lens. "Shanann, Bella, so if you're out there, just come back. This house isn't the same without you." For viewers, the performance was strange. He seemed almost detached, more like someone giving an interview than a desperate husband. Still, the clip spread quickly online, with many initially believing he was a grieving father doing all he could. Meanwhile, police were moving fast behind the scenes. They canvassed the neighborhood, pulling surveillance video. One neighbor told officers that Chris had backed his truck into the garage early that morning, something he had never done before. The footage would later become key evidence. As night fell, the search expanded across the community. Flyers went up. Local news carried Shanann's smiling photos. And the case that began with a routine welfare check was now escalating into a major investigation. The clock was running, each hour raising more questions. Where was Shanann? Where were the girls? And why did Chris what seemed so composed in the middle of it all? By August 14th, the Watts home was no longer just the center of a missing persons case. It was an active crime scene. Detectives returned with cadaver dogs, sweeping each room for signs of human scent. In Shanann and Chris's bedroom, the dogs alerted. In the basement, they showed interest again. To investigators, it was a signal that something deeply troubling had happened inside the house. At the same time, Chris was being closely watched. Detectives noted his unusual calm, his lack of emotion. When friends and neighbors wept openly for Shanann and the girls, Chris stayed composed, even detached. On one neighbor's surveillance video, he appeared restless, pacing and folding his arms tightly while officers reviewed the tape. After Chris left, that same neighbor quietly told police, "He's not acting right." Behind the scenes, investigators began digging into Chris's background, and a critical piece of information shifted the case. They discovered he was having an affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. To detectives, it explained the sudden distance in his marriage and provided a possible motive. When confronted with this fact, Chris admitted to the relationship but insisted it had nothing to do with Shanann's disappearance. Still, the discovery changed everything. What had looked like a missing persons case now pointed toward something darker. Investigators zeroed in. On August 15th, Chris voluntarily sat for a polygraph examination. In the interrogation room, he appeared confident at first, telling the examiner he had nothing to hide. But when the test concluded, the results told a different story. He had failed, and badly. The tone in the room shifted. Investigators leaned in harder. They began pressing him, showing inconsistencies in his statements. Detectives Tammy Lee and Graham Coder told him directly, "There's only one outcome you can't come back from, and that's continuing to lie when we already know the truth." Chris fidgeted, folded his arms, and avoided eye contact. His story began to crack under the pressure. He stuck to denials, but the weight of the questions and the mounting evidence were closing in. Detectives laid it out plainly. "Chris, the time is now. You need to tell us what really happened in that house." Hours earlier, he had stood before cameras pleading for help. Now, under the glare of the interrogation room lights, Chris Watts was cornered. And later that night, investigators would get the answer they had been looking for. The pressure inside that interrogation room finally broke Chris Watts. After hours of denials, he asked to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown in to support him. In a quiet moment alone, Chris leaned across the table and whispered the words that would change everything. He admitted Shanann was dead. He claimed they had argued, and in a sudden moment, he had killed her. He insisted at first that he only harmed Shanann after she had hurt the children, a story investigators would later prove false. But it was the first crack in his wall of lies. When detectives returned to the room, Chris went further. He told them where they could find his family. He had driven them early that morning to a remote site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the oil and gas company where he worked. The location was desolate, wide, open land dotted with storage tanks and equipment. Guided by Chris's directions and later confirmed by GPS data from his work truck, investigators arrived at the site. What they found there confirmed their worst fears. Shanann Watts' body had been buried in a shallow grave near the tanks. Just feet away, her daughters Bella and Celeste had been placed inside separate oil tanks. The retrieval would take hours, requiring care from specialized recovery teams. Detectives documented every step. GPS logs showed Chris's truck leaving the family home around 5 a.m. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera captured him backing into the driveway that morning, loading something into the vehicle. The timeline matched his confession. The chain of evidence came together. The GPS records, the neighbor's video, the alerts from cadaver dogs in the house, and now Chris's own words. The picture was clear. The smiling father who had pleaded for help on television had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters, and hidden them at his job site. For the investigators, it was no longer a search. It was a recovery. As the shock of Chris Watts' confession settled, investigators and the public were left with the most haunting question of all: why? From the evidence and his own words, a picture began to form. Chris had been living a double life. 4 months, he carried on an affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. Texts and phone records revealed their relationship was intense, secretive, and filled with talk about a future together. Investigators believed Chris saw that new life as a fresh start, one that did not include Shanann, Bella, Celeste, or even the baby on the way. But the affair was only part of the picture. The Watts family was drowning in financial trouble. Bankruptcy records showed heavy debt, unpaid bills, and looming expenses. Behind Shanann's smiling social media posts, the marriage was strained. Friends later testified that Shanann worried Chris was pulling away and suspected something was wrong. Then there were the lies. Chris gave investigators shifting stories, first denying everything, then blaming Shanann, and finally admitting to the murders. His contradictions destroyed his credibility. Even the way he staged his actions on August 13th, backing his truck into the garage to hide what he was loading, calmly speaking with officers while his family's belongings were still inside the house, suggested calculation, not impulse. Experts who study family annihilation or familicide say these crimes often share patterns. The parent, usually the father, feels trapped by debt, by failing relationships, or by a desire to start over. Instead of facing the collapse of their image, they make the unthinkable decision to erase the family entirely. Psychologists who later analyzed the case noted Chris fit many of these patterns: financial stress, emotional detachment, and the secret affair acting as a trigger. Investigators called it the most chilling aspect of all. On the surface, Chris Watts seemed ordinary. No violent history, no warning signs in his past. But beneath that calm, suburban exterior was a man who chose deception and destruction over honesty and accountability. The motive, then, was not one single reason. It was a mixture: the affair, the money problems, the image of the perfect family, and the desire for a new life. A toxic combination that ended in tragedy. By the fall of 2018, the case was ready to go to trial. But instead of a drawn-out courtroom battle, Chris Watts chose to plead guilty. On November 6, 2018, he admitted to killing Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn baby the family had already named Nico. The plea was part of a deal to avoid the death penalty. Prosecutors later explained that Shanann's family asked for this outcome. They wanted justice, but they also wanted to spare themselves and the surviving relatives the pain of years of appeals and the public spectacle of a capital trial. On November 19th, the sentence was handed down: 5 life terms without the possibility of parole. 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent, plus additional decades for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with bodies. The most powerful moments came not from the judge, but from Shanann's family. In victim impact statements, her brother described the crushing grief of losing his sister and nieces. Her father spoke of the pain of never seeing Shanann smile again or hearing the girls' laughter. They asked the court to remember not the man who committed the crimes, but the lives of the people he stole. And with that, Chris Watts was led away, condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars, while the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico lived on through the voices of those who loved them. Chris Watts was sent to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where he remains in protective custody. Even behind bars, the case has never faded from public view. The Watts family home in Frederick, Colorado, eventually went up for sale, drawing crowds of onlookers. News specials and documentaries kept the story alive, and in 2020, Netflix's American Murder, The Family Next Door reignited worldwide interest. But beyond the headlines and the documentaries, the tragedy exposed something deeper: how easily a carefully curated online life can hide cracks, pressure, and danger. Shanann's social media painted the picture of a perfect home, but the reality was far more complex and devastating. So we leave you with one question: was Chris Watts a man who simply snapped, or a calculated killer who lived a double life? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you want more deeply researched true crime documentaries, subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark.